America's story begins with a promise: freedom, equality, and opportunity. But for millions of black men, women, and children, that promise was never theirs. Their story began not with liberty, but with chains. In the early 1600s, the first African captives arrived on the shores of Virginia. They had been taken from their homes, families, and villages across West Africa, forced onto ships that crossed the Atlantic Ocean under horrifying conditions. This journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a voyage of suffering beyond imagination. Thousands died at sea, their bodies thrown overboard, nameless and forgotten. Those who survived reached a new world that would treat them as property rather than people. For more than 2 centuries, slavery became the backbone of America's economy. Cotton, tobacco, and sugar made the colonies rich, all built on the backs of enslaved Africans. On plantations from Virginia to Georgia, human beings were bought, sold, beaten, and worked until exhaustion. Families were torn apart, children were born into bondage, and freedom was only a dream whispered at night. To the slaveholders, these people were labor. To the enslaved, they were survivors. They created songs, faith, and culture that carried hope when everything else was stripped away. The rhythms of Africa blended with the hymns of Christianity, forming the roots of spirituals that would one day become the heartbeat of American music. Even in bondage, the human spirit refused to die. The contradiction of a nation built on liberty while living off slavery grew heavier with every generation. Some spoke out, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and used his words as weapons, and Harriet Tubman, who risked her life again and again to guide others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. These heroes turned resistance into a movement. By the mid-1800s, the question of slavery divided the United States. The North began to see slavery as a moral crime. The South saw it as its economic lifeline. The conflict exploded into the American Civil War, a bloody struggle that would decide the future of the nation. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. 2 years later, the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery across the country. Bells rang, prayers rose, tears flowed. A new dawn seemed to break. But freedom on paper did not mean equality in life. The chains had fallen, yet the walls of hatred remained standing. After the war, the South lay in ruins. Formerly enslaved people searched for lost family members, built churches, opened schools, and tried to rebuild lives from nothing. They wanted land, opportunity, and the right to be treated as citizens. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Black men voted, held public office, and began to shape their own destiny. Then came the backlash. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan rose in violence. Politicians in the South introduced new laws that would come to be known as the Jim Crow system. These laws separated black and white Americans in every part of daily life: schools, buses, restrooms, restaurants, even cemeteries. Signs that read "colored" and "white" told people where they could and could not go. The dream of freedom turned into a new nightmare. Lynching became a weapon of terror. Between the late 1800s and early 1900s, thousands of black men and women were murdered by mobs who acted with impunity. No trials, no justice, no mercy. Entire communities lived under the shadow of fear, yet even in the darkness, there was light. Out of pain came progress. Black educators, artists, and thinkers rose to define a culture that could not be erased. Booker T. Washington built schools to teach self-reliance. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of the double consciousness of being black and American, 2 souls in one body. And in small churches and crowded meeting halls, voices lifted in song, preaching faith that someday, somehow, freedom would be real. By the dawn of the 20th century, a new generation was rising. They had never lived in chains, but they carried the memory of those who had. They would become the dreamers, writers, and fighters of a new age. A new century had begun, but the wounds of slavery still bled beneath the surface of the American dream. In the early 1900s, segregation was the law of the land. Black Americans were free in name, but trapped in poverty, violence, and exclusion. They were sharecroppers on the same fields their ancestors had once tilled as slaves. They were laborers who built railroads and cleaned streets, but were denied the right to sit at a restaurant counter. Still, the human spirit searched for expression. Out of pain grew beauty, and from struggle came culture. In the neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, Black creativity began to blossom. The Harlem Renaissance lit a flame of pride and identity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston wrote about love, loss, and the unbreakable will of their people. Jazz poured from smoky clubs, Louis Armstrong's trumpet, Duke Ellington's piano, turning sorrow into sound. The world began to hear the rhythm of a people who refused to be silent. As the Great Depression struck in the 1930s, poverty deepened, but solidarity grew stronger. Communities supported each other through churches, small businesses, and shared faith. Black newspapers told the truth mainstream media ignored. And when World War II erupted, hundreds of thousands of Black men and women served their country, fighting against fascism abroad while still facing racism at home. They returned as veterans, decorated but disillusioned. They had fought for freedom in Europe. Now they demanded it in America. The 1950s became a decade of awakening. In Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger. Her quiet act of defiance sparked a movement. For over a year, Black residents boycotted the city's buses, walking miles to work each day. Their persistence inspired the nation and introduced a young preacher named Martin Luther King, Jr. King believed in nonviolence, a weapon stronger than hatred. His words called upon the conscience of a nation. We must meet physical force with soul force. Under his leadership, marches, sit-ins, and peaceful protests spread across the South. Students filled lunch counters where they were not welcome. Children faced police dogs and fire hoses. Freedom had become a movement, but change did not come easily. Churches were bombed, homes burned, lives taken. In 1955, the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. His mutilated body, shown in open casket photographs, shocked the world. America could no longer hide its brutality behind polite words. The 1960s ignited with courage. In 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington. Under the shadow of the president who ended slavery, Dr. King delivered his timeless speech, "I have a dream." His voice carried the weight of centuries and the hope of generations yet unborn. That same decade saw monumental victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public places. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the ballot box, and yet every step forward was met with resistance. Malcolm X, who had preached self-defense and Black pride, was assassinated in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down in 1968. The nation mourned, riots erupted, and America stood at a crossroads once again. But even in grief, progress refused to die. From classrooms to Congress, from gospel choirs to television screens, Black Americans continued to rise. They had marched through fire, and though the smoke still lingered, a new horizon was visible, one painted in shades of resilience, creativity, and unyielding faith. The echoes of the civil rights era lingered as America entered the 1970s. The laws had changed, but the hearts of many had not. Schools were slowly desegregated, yet cities remained divided. Jobs opened their doors, but prejudice still lived in the shadows of opportunity. The dream that Martin Luther King spoke of was alive, but it was still unfinished. Out of this struggle came a new generation, one that refused to be silent. They were the sons and daughters of the movement, and they were ready to redefine what it meant to be Black in America. In the 1970s, Black Power became more than a slogan. It became a state of mind. It was in the raised fist of athletes on the Olympic podium. It was in the bold rhythms of soul and funk, the poetry of Gil Scott-Heron, and the speeches of Angela Davis. Black Americans began to embrace their roots with pride, their hair, their language, their history. They were no longer asking for acceptance. They were demanding respect. The arts became a weapon of truth. On-screen shows like The Jeffersons and Good Times put Black families into living rooms across America. In music, Artists like Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye sang not only of love, but of justice, of war, and of peace. Their voices became the conscience of a nation still learning to listen. Then came the 1980s and 1990s, decades of paradox. Black entertainers, athletes, and entrepreneurs achieved incredible success. Oprah Winfrey rose to become one of the most powerful women in the world. Michael Jackson's music united millions beyond race and language. Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan became global icons. For a moment, it seemed the dream was within reach. But beneath the glimmer of fame, many communities faced a harsher reality. The crack epidemic ravaged neighborhoods already weakened by poverty. The war on drugs, launched in the name of safety, filled prisons instead of solving problems. Fathers were taken from families, and entire generations grew up in the shadow of incarceration. The system that once used chains had now built cages. Yet even in these dark times, hope found a way to rise. In the late 1980s, a new voice emerged from the streets: rap and hip-hop. It was raw, honest, and unfiltered. Artists like Public Enemy, Tupac Shakur, and NWA spoke the language of the unheard. They told stories of struggle and survival, of dreams and despair. For many young Black Americans, music became both protest and therapy, a mirror of reality and a cry for change. The new millennium brought both triumph and tragedy. In 2008, the impossible became reality. Barack Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States. For millions, it was a moment of pride and healing. A Black man in the White House symbolized the distance the nation had traveled, from the auction block to the Oval Office. But even as Obama stood at the peak of power, America was reminded that racism had not vanished. It had only changed its shape. Names like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd became symbols of a continuing fight. Each death, each injustice, reignited the same question that echoed since the days of slavery. When will freedom truly mean freedom for all? In 2020, the world watched as millions took to the streets, chanting Black Lives Matter. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of existence. It was the modern voice of a 400-year struggle, rising again to demand justice, dignity, and humanity. Through all of this, the Black community has continued to shape America's soul. From literature to science, from sports to politics, their impact is woven into the nation's fabric. Black teachers, doctors, artists, and activists carry the torch forward, determined that their children will not just survive, but thrive. And so the story continues. It is not just a tale of pain, it is a story of perseverance. It is not just about oppression, it is about overcoming. It is not just about being seen, it is about being understood. The history of Black Americans is, in truth, the history of America itself. A story written in blood and hope, in tears and triumph. A story that began in chains and continues in courage. As the sun sets on one generation and rises on another, the dream still whispers through the streets, a dream of equality, of peace, of true freedom. And as long as there are voices willing to tell it and hearts willing to listen, that dream will never die.